It's a quiet night in a small, forgotten town. A stray dog, nothing but skin and bones, stumbles through the shadows, desperate for food. But then, a faint cry pierces the silence. What happens next is something you'll never forget. This is the story of an unlikely hero, a starving, savage dog, and a helpless baby, abandoned and alone, in the face of hunger and hopelessness. Something incredible happened. Stay with me as we unravel a tale of instinct, courage, and heartache that will leave you speechless. It was a forgotten village, tucked away from the chaos of modern life. The kind of place where time seemed to stand still, where dirt roads replaced paved streets, and where the nights were eerily silent, save for the occasional howling of stray dogs. Among the pack of strays that roamed these streets was one dog that everyone knew, but nobody loved. He was an old, scarred creature, his fur patchy and matted with dirt. His ribs jutted out like broken twigs under his mangy coat, and his eyes, though sharp and alert, carried a sadness that no one cared to understand. To the villagers, he was simply a menace. They called him Savage. He would knock over trash bins, growl at anyone who came too close, and fight fiercely with other strays for the smallest scraps of food. His ears were torn from past battles, and his limp was a reminder of a wound that had never healed properly. People avoided him at all costs. Children were warned to stay away, and even adults threw stones to chase him off whenever he wandered too close. To them, he was nothing more than a problem, a filthy, unwanted beast that symbolized the hardships of their village. But beneath his rough exterior was a dog who had learned to survive against all odds. A dog who had been abandoned long ago, left to fend for himself in a world that offered nothing but indifference and cruelty. On most nights, he would scavenge through the village's trash, searching for anything remotely edible. Rotten fruit, discarded bones, stale bread. It didn't matter. He couldn't afford to be picky. But tonight was different. Tonight, the air was colder, and the streets seemed emptier. The usual smells of leftover food were absent, and the trash bins had been cleared earlier than usual. Hunger gnawed at his belly like a relentless predator. He hadn't eaten in days, and his legs felt weak under his own weight. His growls, once fierce and intimidating, had turned into soft, pitiful whimpers. Desperation drove him to venture further than he ever had before, limping toward the outskirts of the village, where the land stretched into open fields and abandoned buildings stood as relics of a forgotten past. Every step was a struggle. His paws, cracked and bleeding, left faint traces of blood on the dirt path. The moon hung high in the sky, casting an eerie glow over the desolate landscape. He sniffed the air constantly, hoping to catch the faintest scent of food, but all he could smell was the damp earth and the cold wind. Just when he thought his strength would give out, he heard it, a sound that didn't belong to the quiet of the night. It was faint at first, almost drowned out by the rustling of the wind, but it was there, a soft, sorrowful cry. The dog froze, his ears perking up, his heart, weak from hunger, thudded in his chest as he tried to pinpoint the source of the sound. It wasn't a sound he recognized. It wasn't the cry of another animal or the distant call of a bird. It was something else, something human. The cry came again, louder this time. It was high-pitched and broken, like the sound of someone in pain. His instincts told him to move on, to focus on finding food. He was starving after all. What good would it do to investigate a noise when his own survival was at stake? But something deep inside him, a faint, buried memory of a time when he wasn't alone, when he wasn't just a stray, pushed him forward. Slowly, cautiously, he followed the sound. His nose twitched as he picked up a faint scent, something unfamiliar but oddly compelling. The cry led him to the edge of the village, where an old, abandoned warehouse stood. The building was a crumbling structure, its walls covered in peeling paint, and its windows shattered long ago. It was the kind of place that even the villagers avoided, believing it to be haunted or cursed. The dog hesitated at the entrance, his body tense and his ears swiveling to catch any other sounds. The cry came again, echoing faintly from somewhere deep inside the building. It was weaker now, as if whoever or whatever was making it was running out of strength. He took a step inside, his claws clicking softly against the concrete floor. The air was colder here, filled with the scent of dampness and decay. Broken furniture and piles of debris littered the floor, making it hard to navigate. But he didn't stop. The cry was his guide, pulling him deeper into the darkness. As he moved further in, the scent grew stronger. It wasn't food, but something else entirely. It smelled of fabric and sweat, a human scent that he hadn't encountered in a long time. His nose led him to a corner of the warehouse, where a small bundle lay hidden under a torn piece of cloth. The dog approached cautiously, his body low to the ground. He sniffed the bundle, and his heart sank. It was a baby, a tiny, fragile human, wrapped in a thin, dirty blanket. The infant's face was pale, their cheeks stained with dried tears. They were crying softly, their voice hoarse from hours of wailing. For a moment, the dog didn't know what to do. He had never seen a baby before, let alone one that was alone and vulnerable. He could sense the baby's weakness, their helplessness, and it stirred something deep within him. He had spent his entire life being ignored, hated, and discarded. But this baby, they were even more alone than he was. The dog lay down beside the baby, his body shielding them from the cold. He licked their face gently, his rough tongue cleaning away the dirt and tears. The baby's cries softened, their tiny body relaxing against the warmth of the dog's fur. Hours passed, and the dog didn't move. He stayed there, his body wrapped protectively around the child, his ears constantly alert for any danger. Hunger still gnawed at his belly, but for the first time in his life, it didn't feel like the most important thing. The night stretched on, and the dog knew he couldn't stay there forever. If the baby was to survive, they needed more than just his warmth. They needed food, water, and someone who could care for them. But he couldn't just leave them there, alone in the darkness. With what little strength he had left, the dog made a decision. He gently took hold of the blanket with his teeth, careful not to hurt the baby, and began to drag them toward the village. The journey was slow and painful, every step draining what little energy he had left. But he didn't stop. He couldn't stop. The baby's faint cries were a constant reminder of why he was doing this. This wasn't just about survival anymore. This was about something bigger, something that even he, a stray dog, could feel in his heart. As the first rays of sunlight broke through the horizon, the dog reached the edge of the village. His legs gave out, and he collapsed onto the ground, the baby still wrapped in the blanket beside him. He let out a weak bark, a final call for help before exhaustion overtook him. The dog's ears twitched at the sound, his body stiffening instinctively. A cry, thin, weak, and human, rose above the eerie stillness of the night. It wasn't a sound he was used to hearing in the quiet, desolate village. He froze mid-step, his nose lifting to the air. The cry came again, faint but distinct, carried by the wind. It wasn't loud or forceful. It was fragile, almost as if the source itself was running out of strength. The dog sniffed the air, his senses sharpening despite his exhaustion. It wasn't the smell of food, nor the familiar scent of another animal. This was different, something unknown. The cry tugged at his instincts, but he hesitated, torn between hunger and curiosity. He was starving, his empty stomach a constant, gnawing reminder of his desperate need to find food. Yet the sound was impossible to ignore. The cry came from the direction of the abandoned warehouse, a crumbling relic on the edge of the village. The locals stayed far away from it, spinning tales of ghosts and misfortune. To the dog, it was just another place to avoid. Its shadowy, decaying structure made it an unwelcoming sight, even for a stray. For a moment, he thought about turning back. Survival was the only thing that mattered, and investigating the sound would only waste what little energy he had left. But the cry came again, weaker this time, and something deep within him stirred. A memory, perhaps, or an instinct he didn't fully understand. The dog lowered his head and began to move, his steps slow and deliberate. His ears remained alert, swiveling to catch every sound as he approached the warehouse. The closer he got, the colder the air seemed to grow, as if the building itself exhaled a chill. He reached the entrance, pausing to survey the scene. The wooden doors hung crookedly on rusted hinges, and the ground was littered with broken glass and debris. The faint moonlight illuminated the decay, casting long, eerie shadows across the floor. The dog hesitated again, his body tense. This place was unfamiliar, and every instinct screamed at him to turn back. But the cry, now barely audible, pushed him forward. With a cautious step, he crossed the threshold into the warehouse. His claws clicked softly against the cold concrete floor, echoing faintly in the hollow space. The scent he had been following grew stronger, mingling with the musty smell of damp wood and rotting metal. It was faintly human but mixed with something else, something that made him uneasy. The dog moved slowly, his nose twitching as he navigated the debris-strewn floor. Broken chairs, shattered glass, and rusted machinery formed a maze of obstacles, but he didn't stop. The cry, now reduced to soft whimpers, guided him like a beacon. As he ventured deeper into the building, the moonlight grew fainter, blocked by the collapsing roof and boarded windows. Darkness enveloped him, and he relied entirely on his senses to move forward. His ears strained for every sound, his nose searching for the source of the scent. Finally, he reached the far corner of the warehouse. There, under a torn piece of fabric that looked like an old blanket, was a tiny bundle. The dog stopped, his body frozen as he stared at the bundle. It was small, too small to be anything but a baby. The faint whimpers confirmed it. This was where the cry had been coming from. The dog lowered his head, sniffing the air cautiously. The scent was stronger now, human, but mixed with the cold, metallic tang of fear. He edged closer, his movements slow and deliberate. Under the dim moonlight that filtered through a crack in the roof, the baby came into view. The child was tiny, wrapped haphazardly in a thin, dirty blanket. Their face was pale, almost ghostly, and their eyes were closed tightly as they whimpered weakly. Their tiny fists trembled in the chilly air, and their breath came in short, uneven gasps. The dog didn't move at first. He stood there, staring at the fragile figure in front of him. He was a stray, wild, untrusting, and driven by survival. This was not his fight, not his concern, and yet he couldn't look away. The baby let out another soft cry, their voice barely audible. It wasn't the loud, demanding cry of a well-fed infant, but the broken, pitiful sound of a child on the edge of exhaustion. The sound pierced the dog in a way he didn't understand. Instinct told him to turn away, to leave, and continue his search for food. But another instinct, buried deep within him, urged him to stay. He inched closer, his nose brushing against the edge of the blanket. The baby's scent was overwhelming now, a mix of human warmth and the bitter cold that clung to their fragile body. The dog's rough tongue darted out, licking the baby's cheek gently. The child stirred, their whimpers softening at the unexpected warmth. Encouraged, the dog lay down beside the bundle, his thin, matted fur pressing against the baby's tiny frame. He curled his body around them, shielding them from the cold that seeped through the warehouse walls. The baby's trembling slowed as they absorbed the dog's body heat. Their cries faded into quiet murmurs, and their breathing became steadier. The dog licked their face again, his actions careful and deliberate, as if he understood the fragility of the life before him. Hours passed in silence, the dog remaining motionless except for the occasional flick of his ears. His hunger, though still present, felt distant now. The baby's presence consumed his attention, filling a void he hadn't known existed. He stayed vigilant, his ears tuned to every sound, and his body coiled protectively around the child. The faint light of dawn began to seep through the cracks in the warehouse, casting a soft glow over the scene. The baby shifted slightly, their tiny fingers curling against the dog's fur. The dog's heart, so used to the hardness of survival, softened at the touch. But he knew this couldn't last. The baby needed more than his warmth. They needed food, water, and the care of a human, someone who could do what he couldn't. The realization filled him with urgency. Summoning the last of his strength, the dog stood up slowly. He nudged the blanket with his nose, wrapping it more securely around the baby. Then, carefully, he took the edge of the blanket in his teeth. The child's weight was almost too much for his weakened body, but he didn't let go. Step by step, he began dragging the baby toward the warehouse entrance. The journey was agonizingly slow, every movement draining what little energy he had left. His paws ached, his body trembled, and his vision blurred from exhaustion. But he didn't stop. The baby's faint breaths were a constant reminder of why he had to keep going. This was no longer about his survival, it was about theirs. As the first rays of sunlight touched the ground outside the warehouse, the dog finally emerged into the open. The baby lay bundled at his feet, their small face peeking out from the blanket. The dog let out a low, desperate bark, hoping someone would hear him. The dog stood still for a long moment, his ribs heaving as he caught his breath. His gaunt frame looked fragile, yet his eyes burned with a determination that seemed almost unnatural for an animal so battered by life. The baby whimpered softly, the sound barely audible over the eerie quiet of the early morning. The faint cries pierced through the stillness, tugging at something primal in the dog, a long-buried instinct to protect, to nurture. He didn't run. He didn't abandon the scene, as many might have expected from a stray, one who had only ever lived for himself, scavenging and surviving in the harshest conditions. Instead, he lowered himself slowly onto the cold ground beside the baby. His body trembled with exhaustion, but he carefully pressed his thin frame against the tiny, fragile figure. His fur was matted and patchy, barely enough to keep himself warm on freezing nights. but he curled tightly around the child as if his warmth alone could be enough to shield them both from the encroaching cold. The baby's cries softened slightly as the dog settled beside them, his breath, warm and steady, mingled with the child's shallow, uneven breaths. The dog shifted carefully, making sure the baby was nestled securely against him. It was an unusual sight, this scarred, feral creature showing a tenderness that defied everything the villagers had assumed about him. Minutes turned into hours. The dog didn't move, even as the biting chill seeped into his bones. His instincts kept him alert. Whenever a distant sound echoed through the warehouse, perhaps the rustle of a tree branch or the faint creak of the wind against the structure, his ears perked up and a low growl rumbled in his throat. His body tensed, ready to defend the child if needed. But no one came. It was just the two of them, alone in the abandoned building, sharing what little warmth they had. The dog's eyes never left the baby. Every now and then, he nudged the child gently with his nose, as if checking to make sure they were still breathing. Once, he licked the baby's tiny face, his rough tongue surprisingly gentle. The child stirred slightly, their small fingers curling against the edge of the blanket. The gesture, so small yet so alive, gave the dog a renewed sense of purpose. As the first light of dawn began to seep through the broken roof, the dog knew that simply staying beside the child wouldn't be enough. The faint sunlight illuminated the baby's pale face, the quivering of their lips a clear sign that the cold was winning. The dog's body heat could only do so much, and the child's cries were growing weaker. He couldn't stay here, not if he wanted the baby to survive. But what could he do? He was just a stray, a dog no one cared about. He had no home, no resources, no way to get help. The enormity of the situation might have paralyzed anyone else, but the dog didn't falter. His instincts, honed by years of survival, told him that he had to act, and he had to act now. With a determined huff, the dog rose to his feet. His legs wobbled beneath him, threatening to give out, but he steadied himself. He nudged the baby one last time, then carefully grasped the edge of the blanket in his teeth. The fabric tasted bitter, stained by the dirt and grime of the warehouse floor, but he held on tightly. He began to move, dragging the baby across the cold, uneven ground. Every step was agonizingly slow. His paws, cracked and sore from years of wandering, scraped against the concrete. His body, already weakened from hunger, protested with every movement. But he didn't stop. The baby let out a soft cry, and the dog paused for a moment, his ears swiveling back to listen. The sound was faint but steady, a sign that the child was still alive. Encouraged, he pressed on. The journey out of the warehouse was treacherous. The dog had to navigate piles of debris, broken furniture, and jagged pieces of metal that littered the floor. More than once, his paw slipped, and the blanket nearly slid from his grasp. But each time, he stopped, adjusted his grip, and continued. When he finally reached the doorway, the early morning sunlight bathed them in its soft glow. The warmth was faint but welcome, a small reprieve from the bitter cold that had dominated the night. The dog paused, panting heavily, his sides heaving with exertion. His vision blurred for a moment, but he shook his head, forcing himself to focus. The journey wasn't over yet. The village was still some distance away, and the path to get there was far from easy. The dirt road leading into town was rough and uneven, winding through fields and patches of overgrown brush. The dog took a deep breath, steeling himself for what lay ahead. He adjusted his grip on the blanket and began to walk. The baby, bundled tightly, was cradled carefully in the folds of the fabric. With each step, the dog's muscles screamed in protest. His body, already weakened by days without food, was pushed to its limits. But he kept going. The sun rose higher in the sky, casting long shadows across the landscape. The dog's progress was slow, his steps dragging as he fought against exhaustion. His paws left faint prints in the dirt, a trail that told the story of his struggle. Once, he stumbled, his legs giving out beneath him. The baby slid slightly, and the dog let out a distressed whine, quickly righting himself and checking to make sure the child was still secure. He licked the baby's face again, as if to reassure himself that they were still breathing. He continued, step by agonizing step, until the rooftops of the village came into view. The sight filled him with a surge of hope, but the journey wasn't over yet. The streets were empty, the villagers still tucked away in their homes. The dog barked a low, desperate sound that echoed through the quiet morning. No one came. He barked again, louder this time, the sound laced with urgency. Finally, a door creaked open, and a figure stepped out. It was an elderly woman, her eyes squinting against the sunlight, as she looked toward the source of the noise. Her gaze fell on the dog and the bundle he was dragging, and her expression shifted from confusion to shock. "What on earth?" she murmured, hurrying forward. The dog stepped back as she approached, his body tense. But he didn't run. He stayed close, his eyes watching her every move as she knelt beside the bundle. The woman pulled back the edge of the blanket, revealing the baby's tiny face. Her gasp was audible, a mix of disbelief and concern. The dog watched as the woman gathered the baby into her arms, her movements quick and gentle. The child let out a faint cry, and the woman's face softened with relief. She looked at the dog, her eyes filling with tears. You brought them here," she whispered. The dog didn't respond, of course, but his body relaxed slightly. His work was done. He had saved the child, defying every expectation, and in doing so, he had shown a capacity for love and bravery that no one would have thought possible. As the woman carried the baby toward her home, the dog followed a few steps behind. His body was weak, his legs barely able to support him, but he stayed close, his protective instincts refusing to wane. As the first rays of sunlight stretched across the small village, painting the dirt roads in hues of gold, a farmer began his morning routine. His name was Abdul, an older man with a weathered face and a heart hardened by years of struggle. Carrying a stick to ward off the strays that often prowled the fields, he strolled toward his land, his eyes scanning the horizon. That's when he saw it. In the distance, the familiar silhouette of the mangy dog caught his attention. Abdul frowned, gripping his stick tighter. He knew this dog well, or so he thought. The animal had long been a source of frustration for the villagers, stealing food and growling at anyone who got too close. Many had tried to chase it away, but it always returned, stubborn and unrelenting. "Not again," Abdul muttered under his breath. He began to approach, his intention clear. He raised his stick, ready to scare the dog off once and for all. But just as he was about to shout, his eyes caught something unusual. The dog wasn't alone. Abdul froze, lowering his stick slightly as he squinted in the early light. There, nestled in a worn and dirty blanket that the dog held gently in his teeth, was a baby. For a moment, Abdul's mind couldn't process what he was seeing. His breath caught in his throat, and his grip on the stick slackened. Was this some kind of illusion? Surely, no stray dog could have done this. And yet, as he stepped closer, the truth became undeniable. The baby's tiny face was visible, pale but unmistakably alive. The child let out a weak cry, the sound barely audible, but enough to shatter the morning stillness. The dog, thin and trembling with exhaustion, stood protectively over the bundle. Its eyes met Abdul's, and in that gaze, there was no fear, no aggression, only desperation, and a silent plea for help. "Ya Allah," Abdul whispered, his voice trembling. He dropped the stick and shouted toward the nearest house. "Come quickly! Someone come! There's a baby!" The urgency in his voice carried across the quiet village. Doors creaked open, and curious faces peered out. One by one, the villagers gathered, their confusion turning to shock as they saw the scene before them. The dog stood still, his body swaying slightly from exhaustion, but he didn't back away. Even as the crowd grew, he remained by the baby's side, his thin frame shielding the child from any perceived threat. A young woman named Fatima, known for her gentle nature, pushed her way through the crowd. She knelt beside the dog, her hands trembling as she carefully lifted the baby from the blanket. The infant whimpered softly, their tiny fists clenching as Fatima cradled them close. "The child is alive," she said, her voice breaking with emotion. Cold, but alive. Gasps rippled through the crowd. Murmurs of disbelief and amazement filled the air. How had this stray dog, this creature they had scorned and feared, managed to save a life? As the villagers processed what had happened, the dog collapsed onto the ground. His legs gave out beneath him, and he lay there, panting heavily. His body was weak, his energy completely spent, but his eyes never left the baby. Even in his exhaustion, he remained vigilant, ensuring that the child was safe. The baby was rushed to the nearest home, where the women of the village worked quickly to warm and feed them. The village elder, an experienced midwife, examined the child and confirmed that they would survive. The news spread like wildfire, and with it came a newfound respect for the dog who had made it all possible. The villagers gathered around the dog, their fear replaced by awe. They had always seen him as a nuisance, a creature unworthy of compassion, but now they saw him for what he truly was, a hero. Abdul, the farmer who had first spotted the dog, knelt beside him, He reached out a hand cautiously, unsure if the animal would trust him, but the dog didn't growl or shy away. He was too tired to resist. Gently, Abdul stroked the dog's matted fur. "You're not just a stray," he murmured. "You're a guardian." The name stuck. From that day forward, the dog was no longer known as the mangy stray who haunted the village. He was Guardian, the protector who had risked everything to save a life. The family of the rescued baby, overwhelmed with gratitude, decided to take Guardian in. They cleaned his wounds, fed him, and gave him a warm place to sleep, a far cry from the cold, harsh streets he had known all his life. For the first time, Guardian had a home. Life in the village changed after that day. The people who had once ignored or mistreated the stray began to see him in a new light. Children who had once feared him now approached him with smiles and outstretched hands, offering scraps of food and gentle pats. Even the adults, hardened by years of prejudice, couldn't help but admire the dog's unwavering loyalty and courage. Guardian's story spread beyond the village, reaching nearby towns, and eventually making its way to the city. Journalists and animal lovers came to document the incredible tale, and Guardian became a symbol of hope and compassion. His journey from a feared stray to a beloved hero inspired countless people, reminding them that even the most unlikely among us are capable of extraordinary acts of kindness. The baby, who had come so close to tragedy, grew up surrounded by love. They never forgot the dog who had saved their life. Guardian, now well-fed and healthy, remained a constant presence in their life, a loyal companion and protector. In the years that followed, Guardian became a legend in the village. His story was told and retold, each version carrying the same message, that kindness and courage can come from the most unexpected places. The villagers, once divided in their treatment of strays, began to change their ways. They built a small shelter on the edge of town, a safe haven for animals who, like Guardian, had been left to fend for themselves. It was their way of honoring the dog, who had shown them the true meaning of humanity. Guardian lived out the rest of his days, surrounded by love and gratitude. Though his body bore the scars of his difficult past, his spirit remained unbroken. He had found his purpose, his family, and his place in the world. And so, the story of Guardian, the dog who defied the odds and saved a life, became a beacon of hope, not just for the village, but for anyone who heard it. It was a reminder that heroes come in all shapes and sizes, and that even in the darkest moments, there is always a glimmer of light. If this story moved you, subscribe for more incredible tales of love and courage.